no secret that shale is one of the most important issues to confront Ohio in recent years, with the potential to transform our state in a number of ways. We thank the Columbus Metropolitan Club for providing a forum to bring together today's group of distinguished guests to share their perspectives. The shale play in Ohio impacts nearly everyone in the state, and in particular, many of our clients at Bricker and Eckler are impacted by this phenomenon. That's why this forum and the ensuing discussion is important to all of us. The complete bio for each speaker is in your forum program, so I will only provide a brief introduction for each. Our first panelist is an applied geophysicist and co-director of the Subsurface Energy Resources Center at The Ohio State University. Please welcome Jeff Daniels. Our next speaker represents his Harrison County community in eastern Ohio as president of the Cadiz Community Improvement Corporation. Please welcome Mike Sleva. Next is the executive director for the Ohio Environmental Council. Please welcome Keith Dimoff. Our moderator this afternoon is co-anchor at ONN, the station where you can see each CMC forum on Sunday afternoons at 1 p.m. Please welcome Jim Heath.
Well, thank you.
On behalf of the CMC, AP, Battelle, Columbia Gas, and the Ohio State University Office of Energy and the Environment, please welcome all of our finalists, or all of our panelists. Jim, the microphone is all yours.
Frank, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. You know, no other issue that I've covered on my program, Capitol Square, the past few years, with the exception of Senate Bill 5, has generated as much interest as hydraulic fracturing. Fracking. Say it with me. Fracking. It's just fun to say. It's the process by which water, sand, and chemicals are injected under high pressure to crack gas-rich shale, releasing that natural gas. Ohio has employed vertical fracking for decades, as we all know. What's new is this horizontal process. On the plus side, fracking promises to create tens of thousands of new jobs. There are expectations that more than 2,000 shale wells will be fracked in the next 3 years in the state of Ohio. But that leads to big questions. Are we ready? Do we know all the risks? Do Ohio's new regulations provide enough safeguards for our air and clean water and our earth? I have a series of specific questions about Ohio's new rules that I'll ask our panelists in a second. But first, Jeff, starting with you, kind of give us an overview of where you think this fracking process is at.
Well, during the past year, I was on this panel last August, the same subject. It's been an extremely busy year. And a time really of adjustment, in my opinion, for both the pro and con side of things. I've given talks and served on 18 talks and forums throughout the state since August, and I've seen a change in attitude, an evolution in attitude out there that I think is good. However, the debate has really been heated at times, and sometimes it's been polarizing. And in my opinion, it's even been unproductive for both sides. So really the emotions out there surrounding this subject have all too often been drowned out any chance for constructive dialogue at times, and I think this is really unfortunate. This is not to say we haven't done anything constructive over the past year. Over the past year, we have had legislation to increase oversight, put more restrictions on drilling and construction of wells, and to better define processes and procedures in the field. We have EPA studies ongoing for water and air quality, a credible economic study that was produced by the state, and also we are beefing up our regulatory force threefold. NIOSH and OSHA are beefing up their air standards, and researchers across the country are working on air quality issues that will have far-reaching implications beyond oil and gas development. I think this is an important point. There will be a conference of government, industry, and academics on stray gas emissions in Cleveland at the end of this month that is going to be attended by industry by government agencies and by university people. Congressional hearings and scientists for the first time have focused on injection wells. 4 days ago, there was a hearing in the U.S. House, and there was a recent article in Scientific American on the subject. So there's a lot of attention out there being played in the last year to many, many issues. Educational efforts have been good and effective as far as they've gone, but in my opinion, they really have not reached as many people as they should. We're doing everything we can, but you can't reach everyone. So I would say, you know, what am I concerned about? I'm concerned about the dialogue and how we develop this dialogue in the future. I think it's really things have to be tamed down. We have to start talking between government, industry, and academia and try to get a solution to some of these problems. We start by finding areas of agreement. Where do we agree on issues? Not where do we disagree. Some people like to stir things up and say, where do you disagree? We need to find out where we agree and go from there. Next, we need to identify specific areas of concerns on both sides where there's serious disagreement, and we find an agreed-to path to answer questions rather than just talking back and forth and talking past each other. We encourage and support university research and business development to develop technologies for production and environmental protection. And where do we stand to develop agreement? In my opinion, there already has been at some of these forums a give and take. Everyone has to give a little on this, and of course, the recent legislation showed some of that give and take. And within my organization at CERC, in conjunction with other universities across the state, we want to provide an interface for research on all topics related to gas shale development, including engineering solutions for drilling and production, better use of natural gas for development of our industry and development of jobs, in addition to issues related to groundwater and air monitoring. And of course, first and foremost at a university, we want to educate students to pursue careers in industry and government that relate to oil and gas development and all of the issues related to oil and gas development.
Thank you very much. For the record, my program doesn't like to stir the pot on this fracking issue. Maybe Karen Kastler over here from State of the Ohio, maybe her show does that. But so let's continue to stir the pot. Keith, give us sort of your overview now of fracking.
Well, sure. Well, one thing that strikes me from something that Jeff just said is that, you know, looking for areas of common agreement, one thing that I would note is that we're have to catch up. I mean, in real time, there are wells being drilled, and we don't yet have the time or the science or the background to really deal with that problem. So in many ways, policy at the local, state, national level right now is playing catch up. Now, there are things that are happening. Jim mentioned new rules. There are new state rules on well construction requirements. There's some new U.S. EPA rules on air quality emissions. There's a big piece of legislation, Senate Bill 315, that Governor Kasich recently signed. But there are still many, many challenges to figuring out how we deal with the so-called shale boom and how it really will play out. And there's a number of things that fit into that. I mean, there's questions about what is our future energy picture here in the state? You know, what mix of wind and solar renewables, along with energy efficiency projects, along with coal, along with natural gas, how can we manage all of the environmental downsides to an energy production? Yes, we all use electricity, but there are larger issues in play here. How do we do it in a way that we protect our air, land, and water? How do we do it in a way where communities are safe and healthy, and that there's really, at the end of this boom, a net local benefit, a net state benefit, a net energy benefit? There's, if you take a big step back and even look at climate change as a driver for a lot of energy policy, and when you look ahead at what some of the predictions are, most recently I think from Ohio State University, predictions of up to a 5-degree increase by the middle to late part of this century. And I have an 8-year-old. He's going to be around. I might not be around, but he will be around to see that. And you look globally at what the dislocation of people and some of the suffering that will happen with that, it really puts really a moral imperative on us to figure out how to do it right and how can the state of Ohio be a leader in how we produce energy and how we produce electricity. So a lot of these things are actually global in scale and local in scale. There are many, many challenges with fracking. I'll be happy to talk to maybe as we have this conversation here. When you look at the number of chemicals that are used, when you look at some of the new techniques that are involved, you'll often hear oil and gas industry say, well, we've been fracking for 40 years. But when you really look at the facts, the kind of processes that they're using right now have been around for 10 to 15 years. This slick water, deep horizontal hydraulic fracturing, the high pressures, the mix of chemicals that are the slick water and the way that they're able to get into the formations. These are new developments. And when you go down that list of chemicals and you see the toxicity and the carcinogens that are in that, and you have to figure out how are you going to deal with the flowback water that comes from those wells and so forth, there are real environmental and health risks to the citizens of Ohio. And while we may be in the midst of a shale boom, we need to take a step back and think, hey, is this safe enough? Is this the right direction for us to go? If we do go in that direction, and there may be economic reasons and other reasons why you can't just say, okay, it's going to stop right now, then how do we do it with the bar raised high enough? How do we do it so that we capture the external costs with this production in a way that it really accounts for the environmental and health impacts, the community impacts, in a way that it would put it on equal footing with things like energy efficiency and renewable energy?
Right, Keith, and I have some questions about that. But first, Mike, from a community development standpoint, where are we at?
Well, we're learning and we're growing every day. We've been involved in this process now for probably about a year, learning something new. We'll learn more new stuff up here today as we go through the discussion. There's a lot of unknown. I come from a small community in eastern Ohio with about 3,500 people. We're trying to capitalize on this as well as the whole state of Ohio. We have a chance to become an energy leader for our country, and we're working diligently to do that. I agree with some of the panelists' comments that we have to have open dialogue when it comes to the environmental issues. On a local level, we rely very heavily on the federal, the state agencies who govern our environment. And so our concerns are that we do it right. But we're moving ahead. We don't want to slow the industry. We know there's a need coming. It's coming very quickly. And we need to have open dialogue to solve these issues, but not slow the process.
Mike, let me ask you, Cadiz could go from being the childhood home of Clark Gable to being known as the fracking epicenter of Ohio. I mean, jobs, jobs, jobs. We're hearing it from both sides, both political parties and both candidates. That has to be a pretty loud message that the community embraces, right? Would you say that jobs, jobs, jobs kind of supersedes right now environmental concerns?
I wouldn't say it supersedes, but that's what everybody in our area is asking about. How many jobs is this going to create? Can I have one of those jobs? And so we are working diligently. I have a couple of people with me today. The mayor of Cadiz, Ken Zitko, is here. Rich Millison, who's come on board with us to do some economic development work. We've been working very hard to create jobs locally. We come from an area that has been slowed. We were a heavy coal area back in the 70s, 60s, 70s. So we've had our downturn for the last 25 or so years. And so we're trying to capitalize on this industry as much as we can because we are an area that needs injections into infrastructure greatly. We need the jobs greatly. But we're not willing to sacrifice the environment at the same time.
Jeff, I want to go back to something you commented on about dialogue. I think we're all familiar with Gasland. and particularly on YouTube, that scene where the gentleman, I think he's in Colorado, turns on his tap water and takes a match and it flames. And I think the producers of that documentary have since admitted that that was common methane, right? But it goes to the bigger question of how do you contain this discussion when there are elements like that that are frankly scaring the bejeebers out of people?
Well, it's very difficult. There's a lot of legacy information out there that lingers on the web. And whether it's right or wrong, it is out there, and it's frequently quoted. So I think that you basically just really have to reach out through the organizations that people trust and publish and produce some the truth that's out there, and that's very difficult. Obviously, in my opinion, universities are one place that can do that very well.
And what has the university found as far as, I mean, is it your sense that hysteria about this issue, particularly in the last 12 months, has grown?
Well, I don't speak for the university. I speak for myself and for the Subsurface Energy Resource Center. But my feeling is in the last 8 or 9 months, like I said, I've been 18 different organizations, everything from environmental organizations to industry organizations, on forums and giving talks. And my feeling is that things are calming down out there. And that's very, very encouraging, because for those of us, including the OSU Extension educators who are out there in the field all the time talking to thousands and thousands of people, this is very, very encouraging. It's showing that the message is getting across and that people are starting to understand. The more people understand, the less hysteria we have.
I mean, obviously environmental concerns here, environmental groups, it's sort of your responsibility to make it clear of what we're doing and what the ramifications may be. Where is the line? I mean, obviously false information is going over the line, but as you get information out there, I mean, do you feel sometimes this hysteria question, or are you just putting facts on the table?
Well, I think people are rightfully concerned about what's going to happen in their communities. I would note that Duke University did a study where they did fingerprinting on methane and found it associated with hydraulic fracturing. So it's not just a documentary filmmaker that is, I think, raising some very legitimate questions. There's a number of other studies in Wyoming, and US EPA is in the midst of a peer-reviewed study at the moment, trying to get a handle on what the scientific basis for risk assessment is with this, which I think goes back to my earlier point about, you know, are we going to get ahead of the curve or not here? Are we going to end up with a legacy like we did from coal mining or not? We still have rivers that run orange in southeastern Ohio because of mistakes that were made when coal mining happened here. And we have, right now we have out-of-state extractive industries with Ohio right in the center of its target. And so I don't think it's hysteria as much as people saying, wait a minute, what's going to happen to my health? What's going to happen to my community? What's going to happen to my air?
And obviously legitimate questions there. Some states on the other extreme, I was looking at California yesterday, are trying to pass legislation to stop this in its tracks altogether. Are you confident and comfortable about the chemical mix that's going into the fluid that's being shot down into the earth?
Well, no, not comfortable with it for a couple.
What's wrong with it?
Well, there's a number of toxic chemicals and carcinogens that are on that list. Hundreds of chemicals are used. Oil and gas industry has developed this slick water technique because they're able to reach this shale that they weren't able to reach before, in part because of these friction-reducing chemicals and other additives that they use. One of the more troubling aspects of all this, though, is really some of the proprietary trade secret provisions that are available to these companies that really ultimately hide what these chemicals are from the local community.
And that was the new rules and regulations that were approved last month. That was that was a primary concern. Companies claiming that they needed to keep that confidential because it's a competitive business.
In particular, in the legislation that was just passed, there was at the last minute, and you talk about. I share the other panelists' desire for a healthy dialogue and a scientific-based dialogue. But sometimes when you're at the State House, you see things like what happened with what has been dubbed the Halliburton Amendment, where after months of discussion and months of hearings in the House and Senate, in the last week, additional trade secret provisions were added at the last minute into the bill, and that's not public dialogue, and it's not healthy for the kind of statewide energy policy that we should have.
Mike, you mentioned that the mayor was in the audience with us. Comfortable with the new rules and regulations, that it's enough protection? Because the last thing a mayor of any municipality or city or town in Ohio wants is some sort of unknown or unsuspected calamity to arise from this. Are you comfortable with the level of regulation at this point?
We are comfortable at this time. I think as we progress, there's going to be new things found all the time, and hopefully those changes will be made whenever anything is found to be possibly dangerous or negative impact. We have a lot of faith in the federal state agencies that are handling these issues. But it's an ongoing process, and it will always be an ongoing process, as everything is, that we hope that we monitor this industry closely, but we don't slow the growth of the industry, because our area needs it, Ohio needs it, and basically the country needs it. So I think it can be done correctly and safely for everybody involved.
Just a few minutes, we'll take your questions. I see a microphone right here. I suspect that's where that will happen. So if you have any questions of your own, please line up in the mic, and I'll start turning to you in just a few moments. But I want to put a couple other things on the table, because we hear all of this, and we'll try to clear it up. And Jeff, let me ask you, seismic activity, earthquakes, something else that we have heard attached to fracking. Here in Ohio, I think it was determined that it was actually the process of putting wastewater in that caused the series of small tremors last year. But, I mean, is that a concern?
It is, first of all, you have to separate out those two processes, and I'm glad that you did, because injection wells and the process of hydraulic fracturing are very separate. I mean, they're lumped into just fracking sometimes by people, and they're very separate processes. Hydraulic fracturing has not been shown to cause any earthquakes as far as I know. This process what happened in the Youngstown area was a pretty unique situation where they drilled 240 feet into hard rock in the basement, and they intersected a fracture zone. And that is really the only case of where we have what you would call earthquakes. And as a geophysicist, I'd like to clarify that this was a magnitude 4 earthquake, and I will say, yes, it was an earthquake. But little tremors in the ground occur constantly. If you go down to OSU and look at our seismograph, you see constant tremors. The earth in the subsurface is a very, very noisy place. And anytime you do anything in the subsurface, you will have very, very small tremors. But most of these you cannot feel at the surface. It has to be well above a magnitude 3.0 before you're going to feel it on the surface, and around 4 before it's going to cause any damage. And that is according to me as a geophysicist, according to the USGS. I could go on, and I can spend an hour talking about this subject, but to me, out of the 180, 90 wells that we only have one situation where we've had an earthquake.
Keith, are you good with that?
Well, I'm not a geophysicist, and I won't pretend to be, but I do have a few facts that I think, again, kind of point to the scale that we're dealing with here. I think that USGS has noted a 6-fold increase over 20th century levels of earthquakes, and has pointed to that they are almost certainly man-made, albeit magnitude 3.0 and higher. It was mentioned a distinction between the actual fracking of the production well versus disposing of the wastewater. What you're seeing is that flowback water that has a lot of chemicals in it is very difficult to treat, and certainly unsafe to discharge to streams and rivers as part of like what you would now have like the city of Columbus or CADA's wastewater treatment plants. This is chemical, very high highly contaminated flowback water that needs to go somewhere, so to speak. And what you're seeing a lot at the Ohio's underground injection wells is a lot of Pennsylvania wastewater coming in. Ohio has a lot of what are called Class 2 injection wells. I think we have well over 100 Class 2 injection wells. I think what has been said about the Youngstown quake is that it went into an unknown fault. And I think some of the question is do we have the policy infrastructure, the legal infrastructure to watchdog these kinds of things? Ohio's geosurvey budget has been cut year after year as part of the state budget process. I think to get a grip on the Youngstown earthquakes, they had to bring in seismographs from, I believe, is it Columbia University, Jeff, I think, maybe? You know, are we able to really, you know, protect from you know, earthquakes and all of the other, you know, we're talking, when we talk, sometimes the oil and gas industry will say, for example, that there hasn't been any evidence of aquifer contamination from fracking. And I think when you look deeper at the sort of some of the semantics that are used with that, is that they're saying fracking is just that moment of the well fracking, and they're not looking at production, they're not looking at flowback, they're not looking at wastewater disposal. And I think we need to really look holistically at what are the costs of this shale play here in Ohio.
All right, Keith, I want to get back to aquifers in a second, but first, sir, if you could give us your name and your question, who you're directing it to.
My name is Perry Fisher, and two remarks that were already made about catching up and hysteria messages. This is a problem of information disbursement. Pennsylvania's been doing this for 10 years, and you can find articles in newspapers and reports of what's been going on there on the web, but that's not shared in this community or in this legislature. And this paranoid attitude among legislators that in Pennsylvania produced a doctor can know provision, that only if you're determined to be sick from something the doctor can't identify, can the doctor be given the list of those protected ingredients, but they have to kill him because he must not tell it to anyone. He is only allowed to know that it may have caused a problem. Now, this kind of industrial attitude is totally not progressive at all. You can't proceed. We need this great source of energy. Siemens is building a huge gas turbine plant in Charlotte. They're going to produce gas, electrical energy that will save us all trillions of dollars. We're going to use about 1 billion gallons of water from Lake Erie and other tributaries, but we need to know how to manage that, how to plan for it, and how to anticipate its effect on our ecology and our own water needs. We're not addressing those. We're afraid. We're paranoid.
All right, let's pick that point up about paranoia, and I think that actually, Jeff, it goes back to something we were talking about earlier. I mean, at the end of the day, you all do the research and get the facts. We try to get those facts out on the table, but sometimes, particularly in this 24-hour news cycle, and with Twitter, which I'm a big fan of, I love to tweet, but information becomes, even information that's not verified or accurate, gets out there in the mainstream very, very quickly.
Well, we live in a free society, right? Thank goodness. And that information is allowed to get out there in the public. And I'm confident that over time, the general public will get the information and be able to find trusted sources of information and find a balanced view on things and be able to make that. Most people will be able to make that evaluation themselves. They have to in our society.
And I think, Mike, jobs, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that kind of overrides a lot of fear and gets people more interested in the potential of jobs.
Right, and with any new industry, there's always fear. People speculate, so you're always going to have two sides of the argument. But again, we feel that we need to move forward. We feel it's much needed, and but there are concerns, as Keith says, that always will be debated and always will need to be addressed. But I think we can do that.
Sir, could you give us your name?
Zach Space with Voorhees Advisors, and a native of Tuscarawas County, eastern Ohio, which also lies kind of in the heart of the Utica Shale region. First, I want to welcome Mike, fellow eastern Ohioan, and Mayor Zitko to Columbus. It's good to see you. Keith, thank you for the work that you and your organization have been providing to Ohioans for many years. My question has to do with the water supply. And Keith, you and I had a chance to briefly discuss this before the meeting. Understanding that the production is going to happen, I mean, it's a given at this point that we're going to see extensive drilling operations, and understanding that these operators need a lot of water. As it stands right now, much of this water is going to be removed from rivers and creeks and aquifers and either sold or just taken by the producers. It's a necessary part of the production process. And this region happens to overlie the Muskingum Watershed Conservancy District, which holds 4 or 5 large reservoirs that we think could be an adequate source of water for these operations. And I know there have been some discussions about the possibility of allowing villages and towns to contract with the MWCD to buy the water at a cheap price, turn around and sell it to the producers at market value, and utilize the proceeds, which should be relatively significant, to put back into the wastewater infrastructure within these counties, building wastewater treatment systems and lines, which would replace a lot of these old septic tanks, that many of which need replaced. And so, Keith, I'm interested in moving. I understand that, and we all agree, this has come on us very, very quickly, and I commend the local officials for their ability to deal with this situation. But I'm curious as to your perspective over the long term as to how the MWCD Conservancy can be an asset in terms of not just providing water to the producers, but also enhancing the environmental infrastructure within the region.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and Zach, I again apologize. Earlier I said he was from New Philadelphia, and I know you're from Dover. So, well, a couple things about the actual water supply. They are large volumes that are used. I think traditional vertical fracked wells were around 100,000 gallons, and under this this new type of drilling, we're looking at 5 million gallons. One good part, and Governor Kasich deserves credit for this, in Senate Bill 315 that was recently passed, it was at his initiative that for the first time, these drilling companies need to disclose where the source water is coming from. Up until enactment of that bill, that was not required at all. And it could, at least now we know, is it supposed to come from a reservoir, from groundwater, from a stream. And indeed, there could, in the end, if you are trying to come up with responsible policies, maybe some reasons that you might pull it from a reservoir rather than a stream, and you might want to take those proceeds and invest it in other infrastructure to help the community. At the end of the day, there's 2 things that come to mind about source water. One is you'll sometimes hear the oil and gas industry say, well, a large utility plant, Bayshore up in Toledo or whatever, uses very, very large volumes of water. But it's important to remember that they are returning it to Lake Erie. When you are using water for this fracking operations and you're ultimately injecting it into injection wells, you're taking it out of the water cycle forever. You're polluting it and taking it out of that water cycle. The other thing is that if we are going to have a responsible energy policy in this country and in this state, there's no getting around accounting for all of these external costs that are associated with something like shale gas. And the water is one piece of that, and all of the health impacts is another piece of that. We're operating, unfortunately, without a responsible way to deal with carbon and greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. We don't have an international climate agreement. We don't have a national cap and trade or carbon tax or whatever kind of policy that would deal with that. So we're not capturing these external costs, like in this case where we're commodifying a water supply and for basically out-of-state industrialists, and we're just not capturing the ultimate cost to society of this. I don't fault the community of CAT is with dealing with, hey, they're caught up in the middle of all of this. I'm very sympathetic. My grandfather was from a coal mining family in Jackson. My father was a factory worker his whole life. I'm very sympathetic. It's at the end of the day, is this ultimately going to be to economic benefit of the local community? Is it ultimately going to be to society's larger benefit?
And Keith, in 30 seconds or less, and we'll get to our next question. Are you surprised that some states are leading in regulations, the federal government, on this?
Well,
the congressman reminded me of that, and I didn't get a chance to follow up with him.
Yeah, well, US EPA, for example, recently issued some good air quality regulations. States are able to have their own environmental regulations, and when it comes to actual oil and gas drilling regulations, that basically is delegated to the states. So each state has to kind of play, catch up. Very quickly, the state of Pennsylvania tried to play catch up. I think they've had $25 million in fines that they've had to levy in the past 4 years. So, when you get enforcement in play, I think you start to see, well, hey, there really are problems here.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Bill Lafayette. I'm an economist. I'm owner of Regionomics, and I've got a really pragmatic question for Mike. As you start to ramp this industry up, as you start to see activity begin, what sorts of workforce needs and stresses are you seeing or anticipating, and how are folks out there responding to those needs?
We're going to have a lot of construction jobs. There's going to be a big need for welders for the underground pipeline installation. Some of the companies that we've been in discussion with have already expressed an interest in working with our local vocational schools and local colleges to train the workforce to be able to do those types of jobs. Those are the two main and industry specific. We have a midstream company that is going to hopefully be creating 60 or 70 jobs within our community. Those will be specific trained, what they will need for their plant workers, and they will take care of that training. But we see a need for construction workers, welders is the main thing that we're seeing right now.
Mike, is the industry, are they working closely? I imagine they would work closely with you all, because there have to be plenty of questions from the community about potential jobs and leases and things like that. Are you feeling that the industry is cooperative here? They're working side by side with you in your community as you move toward more fracking?
Yes, I think so. This whole process is moving, some phases move along at a lightning pace, and other things seem to just be at a standstill. So the training is needed today so that those jobs can be filled and be moved forward tomorrow. But they're being very upfront with us. They're wanting to do this. It's just a matter of trying to find the time to get it done. Yes, sir.
Hi, David Chesbrough, COSI, and my science and engineering background takes me back about 40 years in the energy field, but I'm actually going to follow up on economics. So because jobs and economy are used as kind of the countervailing argument on this, I want to see if any of you, including Bill, maybe should have kept you up with the mic here. We've seen many times in our history booms and busts with the extraction of resources. You can think of either, the gold rush, you can think of what we've seen in Pennsylvania, Ohio with coal and the like. So we've got two factors here I want to see if anyone can relate to. One is that you've got a complete economic disruption in the cost of energy, so that all of a sudden natural gas is a much different price point, which changes all the ROIs on people who've made investments in others, whether it be renewables, coal, whatever the case may be. And you're also seeing companies like Chesapeake, starting to all of a sudden become tenuous because of the drop in price, because of the glut starts to give an economic return that's different than maybe was calculated first. So that's the first half of the question. Second half of the question is, we talk about jobs, but we all, again, know the boom and busts that we've seen. And so I guess I'm looking at, maybe it's you from the economic development or anyone else, do the promise of jobs and the promise of the good times, is it transient and we should be looking at it as transient, or is there really a sticking effect here? Is there something that really does last on a long-term sustainable basis versus something which is just the rush of the moment with a lot of hype and a lot of activity, but then in 10, 15 years, we're back into another depressed time and era?
What do you think, Mike?
I think it's a good point that we've had many side discussions about this. Unfortunately, we can't predict the future, and we'd all like to because we'd all be rich now. But I believe that Ohio is positioned well because we have the liquid gases underneath us, the oil, the liquid gas, that is really what they're craving now. Pennsylvania was more of the dry natural gas. I think that's why you're seeing a lot of the play coming to our area now. So we have an advantage, and we have to take advantage of we have to be ready to go with that. And I think that we will see this play here for many years to come. We're preparing ourselves for that. We're trying to concentrate our economic development efforts, attracting the companies that will be here long after the drilling process is done. The processing companies, the companies that compress the gas, get it to market. So those are the issues that we're trying to focus in on. Because we do know the drilling process is going to be a window of opportunity. But we believe that the gas will be coming out of the ground for many years to come.
I just want to follow up that, Jeff. It seems like fossil fuels were going away, right? 20 years ago, I remember we were all talking about that was the end of the fossil fuel, right? And here we are, fracking. There's plenty down there. I mean, where are we at? Is there plenty down there?
I pretty much got out of the oil and gas side of things in education and spent my time on environmental issues for about 15 years because of the economics had gone down, and it also affects the way we turn out students, so it affected what I do as well. But in my 44-some years in this business, I have never seen anything like this, and we're looking at something that is very, very different from oil and gas industry of the past, because I say that I like to say, and it's true, that in the past we were tapping into reservoirs that were, I don't want to get too much into geology speak, but they were isolated, and it was kind of like hunt and peck and find them, okay? And that was the oil and gas industry many years ago. Today, there certainly is going to be some of that in shale. But really what we're looking at today is not the secondary oil that is accumulated in different spots, but we're looking at kind of what I like to call the mother lode, okay? This is the source rock for oil and gas. The shale is the source rock for oil and gas. And it's down there, and it's trapped where it has formed. It has been trapped in that shale. So it's going to be a more reliable source of energy for a longer period of time, I believe, than anything we've seen. And it's not just going to be the Utica Point Pleasant Shale. There are other shales, I'm told, that also have potential.
Keith, I mean, it's a hot day out there. We all like turning on the air conditioning, right? I mean, shale maybe gets us to renewables, which I know that a lot of environmentalists have been pushing for that financially are just not there yet.
Well, there is some, setting aside the economics for a moment, I'll come right back to that. I mean, there are some deep questions to answer about natural gas versus coal in the context of emissions and whether it's emissions of mercury or whether it's greenhouse gas emissions. Sometimes it is touted as a bridge fuel. I would posit that the question is it's a bridge to where? Without some of those other international agreements and national climate, carbon exchanges and so forth, is this boom going to disincentivize investment in energy efficiency? Is it going to disincentivize investment in renewables? I will add a couple cautionary notes on some of the optimistic projections that some companies make, maybe for their own financial benefit. The Department of Energy in January of this year reduced, I think, by nearly 70% their estimate of the gas available from Marcellus Shale. Now, there is a Utica Shale formation that goes farther west in the state that does have a lot of the so-called wet gases. Last thing I'll leave you with is Chesapeake Energy has been a large player in this. I think if you look at, I mentioned a moment ago, Pennsylvania's fines. Chesapeake was at the top of their list in terms of fines. You can read in the business pages some questions about whether Chesapeake is an investor in communities or whether it is an Enron type corporation. And I think the other thing that you have to have in this mix is a lot of the subsidies that fossil fuels get in our tax structure, and whether it's equitable with ultimately a good domestic energy policy.
All right. Sir.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Bill Wagner. I have a question of Professor Daniels. And,
Sir, could you come a little bit closer to the mic?
Go closer to the microphone.
Thank you, sir.
Bill Wagner, and I have a question for Professor Daniels. And my question is so convoluted, I find it necessary to read it. At one time, it was predicted that electricity generated by nuclear energy would be too cheap to meter. In reality, the diametric opposite currently exists to a great extent, because of untold number of lawsuits and snail daughter attitudes. Well, oops, excuse me. My question is, do you foresee the same roadblocks facing fracking?
Thank you, sir. Excellent question.
Thank you.
You know, I don't really draw a parallel between the two. I think they're very different in the fact that we're looking at a resource here that is a lot easier to access and produce, whereas with nuclear energy, because of other issues related to it and safety concerns and huge issues surrounding how nuclear power was generated, it's just a huge upfront investment to begin with, and it takes a long time to develop a nuclear power plant as opposed to drilling wells to get some return on investment. So I wouldn't parallel the two of them. So I do not think that I don't predict the same fate for oil and gas production that we found in nuclear. I think
And
it's
perhaps
a very
better-
different animal.
Better PR, right? I mean, nuclear had some rocky times 20 years ago, and yet when you look at the megawatts that a nuclear plant produces,
Right.
you can't, and it's basically clean energy, except for what you do with the rods afterwards and Yucca Mountain and some of those things, obviously. But I mean, nuclear, it has fallen off the charts. Are you surprised by that?
I guess I'm not surprised by it. I think that personally, I think if you look at any of the projections, any of the models for the future, and a lot of environmental people would even agree that nuclear is a viable option for the future, and in terms of a clean fuel. So we'll see what happens. There's a lot of technological developments that could bring it back, but it's going to take a lot to bring it back.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am, we want to get to your question, too.
Hello.
Hi.
I think this might be a nice segue to my question, having brought up nuclear energy. My name's Laura Marugla. I'm a chemical engineer at Ohio State University. So in this, I think, Mr. Dimoff, you mentioned the energy-water nexus in the sense that we know with thermoelectric power generation, we do have some consumption of water. Mostly it's returned with a bit of heat contamination, but the majority of it does return with a little bit of evaporation. But what we see with shale is this high volume consumption, and I think the public is not getting the information in terms of why we can't treat that water. Is it just a capacity issue? What I understand is there's also a high presence of radionucleotides as well as lots of minerals that are, it's not necessarily, in other words, what's going into the water, but what's coming out with the water. And I wonder if you can comment on that a bit more in terms of the feasibility to treat the water at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there are naturally occurring radioactive elements in the formations that are drilled into, and yes, strontium and others are apparent in the flowback water, along with a lot of the chemical additives that are used to inject. As far as treatment, There's a lot of chemicals. It's not, again, sort of your City of Columbus wastewater treatment challenge. There's a lot of chemicals. Part of the state of Pennsylvania for a while allowed discharge to streams until they realized what a problem that was. There may be some options for companies to recycle that flowback water and use it again in another hydraulic fracturing event. You do get contaminated sludge from the filter presses or whatever are used as part of that treatment process. Again, maybe I think we're probably playing catch up. There are hundreds of chemicals that are in that water to begin with, and I think in terms of wastewater treatment technology, and I have a civil engineering background myself in wastewater treatment, I think there's going to be real challenges to come up with something that's going to be workable there.
Keith, just a quick follow-up. Workers safe at these fracking sites, and what do we know about silica?
Well, silica dust has been long known to be a danger. As far as worker safety, we're talking about a lot of chemicals. We're talking about a lot of diesel emissions. One thing I'll mention quickly in terms of air pollution, there are parts of the state of Wyoming that just recently came out of compliance for ozone standards. You think of Wyoming and Big Sky Country and that kind of stuff, and their ozone levels were comparable to the Los Angeles area, and it's because of oil and gas production in Wyoming. So I think you've got risks to communities. You do have risks to workers as well. Mm-hmm.
My name's Jane Scott. Almost all of you have mentioned that we need to find out more about this. Who is we? Who is doing the research? How is the research? How is the information being disseminated to the folks who need to know? And who's paying for that resource?
Jeff, you want to take that first?
Sure. I think at the university, as I mentioned before, our extension is out there working and giving talks, across the state. And I think, other groups are. I do it as well. So, people can attend those. And our website, our CERC website, also provides information, as do other organizations in the state. I will tell you what I do when I want to get two views on this. I read the New York Times and I read the Wall Street Journal. and then I basically get two views, and that's what I try to do.
Mike, take us home. Workers are asking you questions. Citizens are asking you questions. What is your source, and how do you get information out community-wise?
We try to attend as many public functions, business association meetings, luncheons, public meetings, anything that we can do to get the word out. Our local paper is very good at running articles, trying to get out as much information as possible. It's kind of hard in a small community to let everybody know, but we do the best we can.
Gentlemen, thank you, and it's always an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, before we leave today, I'd like to remind you to make reservations for our forum, not next Wednesday, but a week from next Wednesday, July the 11th, about Columbus Commons. And I want to invite you all to continue today's conversation with the speakers and your fellow attendees over coffee and cookies in the lobby. Once more, please join me in thanking today's sponsors, Battelle, AEP, Columbia Gas, and the Ohio State University Office of Energy and the Environment. And last but not least, let's thank our speakers for a truly informative forum, Jeff Daniels, Mike Sleva, Keith Demoff, and moderator Jim Heath. Thank you all for being here. Happy 4th.